Her children took everything, except the one place they thought was worthless. The stew had started to burn before she noticed anything else. The smell hung in the kitchen, sharp and wrong. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching her husband sitting still at the table, his hand resting near a bowl he never touched. Outside, the neighborhood moved on like any other afternoon. But inside that house, something had quietly ended, and something else had already begun shifting beneath her feet. If you were in her place, would you trust your family or trust your instincts? The stew had been left too long. Margaret noticed it before anything else. The smell reached her halfway down the hallway, sharp, slightly bitter, like something that had meant well but lost its timing. She paused there, one hand resting lightly against the wall, listening. The television murmured faintly from the living room. A man's voice, cheerful, asking questions no one was answering. She stepped into the kitchen. The pot on the stove had started to catch at the bottom. Not burned black, not yet. Just enough to change the scent of the room. The window above the sink was fogged over, a thin film of condensation that blurred the view of the backyard into gray shapes. "Frank?" she called, not loudly. He was at the table, sitting the way he always did in the afternoons, shoulders slightly forward, one elbow near the edge, the other resting beside his plate. A spoon lay in the bowl in front of him, untouched. His glasses were still on, tilted just a little off-center, as if he had meant to adjust them and forgot. Margaret stood there. She didn't move closer right away. There was no rush in her body, no sudden panic, just a stillness that felt heavier than it should. She had seen him slowing down for years, watched the small things go first, the way he stopped fixing things around the house, the way he took longer to stand up from his chair, the quiet pauses in conversations where he seemed to drift somewhere she couldn't follow. This wasn't unexpected, but it still felt wrong. Not the fact of it. The timing. The shape of it. The way everything in the room kept going as if nothing had happened. The stove was still on, the television still talking, the clock on the wall ticking with the same steady rhythm it had kept for 20 years. Margaret stepped closer. "Frank," she said again, softer now. She reached out and touched his shoulder. Cold didn't come right away. It never did in movies the way people expected. There was still warmth there. Fading, but present. The kind that made you question your own instincts. She waited. Then she understood. Not suddenly, not like a sharp break, more like something settling into place, a quiet recognition that had been forming for a long time and had finally arrived. She turned off the stove. The click of the knob sounded louder than it should have. The flame disappeared. The smell lingered. Then she went to the phone. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately, dialing numbers she had known by memory for decades. Her voice, when she spoke, sounded like someone else's. Calm, clear, practical. "Yes," she said. I think he's gone." There were questions, instructions, words she had heard before, just never directed at her like this. She followed them, opened the front door, waited. The house filled in stages. First the paramedics, boots on the floor, equipment that seemed too large for the space, voices that stayed low, respectful, careful with their tone. Then a neighbor, Mrs. Callahan from across the street, still wearing her coat, her hair not fully brushed. She stood in the doorway at first, unsure if she should come in, then stepped forward anyway. "Oh, Margaret," she said, and reached for her hand. Margaret let her. She noticed things she wouldn't have expected to notice. The way the paramedic adjusted the sheet, smoothing it carefully over Frank's chest. The way one of them glanced at the clock before writing something down. The faint squeak of the front door as it opened and closed again, over and over. Time didn't stop. It moved forward piece by piece without asking. Someone asked her if there was family to call. "Yes," she said. "My children." The words felt distant, as if they belonged to a different part of her life. Phones rang. Voices changed on the other end. There was a shift in the air, subtle but immediate. The quiet of the house gave way to movement, purpose, direction. Daniel arrived first. He came in quickly, keys still in his hand, his coat half-buttoned. He stopped when he saw the kitchen. His eyes moved once across the room, taking everything in. Then he stepped forward. "Mom," he said, and his voice was steady, controlled. He touched her shoulder, the same place she had touched Frank's. Erin came not long after. She moved differently, slower, her eyes already damp, though no tears had fallen yet. She hugged Margaret tightly, holding on for a second longer than necessary. "I'm here," she said. "We're here." And just like that, the house changed again. Voices layered over each other. Plans began forming before Margaret fully understood what they were about. Words like arrangements and calls and next steps slipped into the room as naturally as the smell of the stew still lingering in the air. Someone turned off the television. Someone else opened a window. Margaret sat down at the table, in the chair across from where Frank had been. The bowl was still there, the spoon resting inside, tilted slightly to one side. She looked at it for a long time. People moved around her. Chairs shifted, doors opened and closed, phones rang again. The world did not stop. It reorganized. And Margaret sat there, hands folded loosely in her lap, watching it happen. Not resisting, not questioning, just noticing. The quiet she had felt when she first stepped into the kitchen hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape. It was still there, underneath everything, beneath the voices and the movement and the careful, practiced efficiency of people who knew what to do in moments like this. But it didn't feel peaceful. It felt unfinished, like something had been interrupted mid-sentence, and no one, not even her, knew how to finish it. The house didn't stay quiet for long. By the next morning, it had a rhythm again. Not the old one, the slow, familiar movement of two people sharing space, but something quicker, sharper. Voices came and went. Doors opened, closed. Phones rang, stopped, rang again. Margaret woke before sunrise, out of habit. For a moment, she forgot. She lay there listening to the soft hum of the heater kicking on, the distant sound of a car passing outside, the faint creak of the house settling into the cold. Then he remembered. It didn't hit her all at once. It never did. It settled in the same way everything else had, quietly, steadily, without asking permission. She sat up slowly and reached for her robe. In the kitchen, the air still carried a trace of yesterday's stew, not as strong now, but enough to remind her. Someone had cleaned the pot. The counters were wiped. The bowl from the table was gone. The space had already been reset. Daniel stood by the sink, holding a phone between his shoulder and ear, speaking in a low, controlled voice. "Yes," he was saying. "Thursday works. Morning, if possible." He glanced at her and gave a small nod, then turned slightly away, lowering his voice further. Erin was at the table. A stack of papers spread neatly in front of her. A pen rested between her fingers, tapping lightly against the edge of a folder. You're up early, Erin said, looking up with a quick smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Margaret nodded. I always am. There was a pause. Then Erin gathered a few of the papers into a smaller pile and slid them slightly to the side, as if making space. Do you want coffee? She asked. Margaret shook her head. Not yet. Daniel ended his call and set the phone down on the counter. He exhaled once, like he had just finished something important, then turned toward them. They can do Thursday morning, he said. 10 o'clock. Erin nodded. That's good. Neither of them explained what they meant. Margaret didn't ask. She moved slowly around the kitchen, opening a cabinet, then closing it again. The motions felt automatic, like her body was following instructions it had memorized years ago. Mom, Daniel said gently, stepping closer. We're going to take care of everything, okay? You don't have to worry about anything right now. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that. That was what made it harder to question. Over the next 2 days, the house filled with decisions. The funeral home called. A time was set. Clothes were chosen. Words like service and arrangements and viewing moved through conversations as if they had always been there, waiting. Margaret sat at the table while Erin flipped through a booklet, pointing to options. This one is simple, Erin said. I think Dad would have liked that. Margaret nodded. Daniel handled the calls. Insurance, utilities, people Margaret didn't recognize. He spoke with the same steady tone each time, writing things down on a yellow legal pad, checking boxes, moving from one task to the next without hesitation. At some point, the papers began to appear. They came in folders, clean, organized, labeled. Erin would slide one toward Margaret, tapping a line lightly with her pen. Just here, she would say. It's mostly standard stuff. Margaret would take the pen. She didn't rush. She never rushed. She would read a few words, names, dates, familiar terms that felt safe, and then sign. Her name looked smaller on the page than it used to. Daniel stood nearby, watching, not impatient, but attentive, ready to move on to the next step as soon as she finished. There was no pressure in their voices. No urgency. Just a quiet expectation that things would continue. And they did. The day of the funeral came and went in a blur of dark coats and soft voices. People she hadn't seen in years came up to her, touching her arm, saying things she knew they meant, but couldn't fully absorb. I'm so sorry. He was a good man. Let us know if you need anything. She nodded. She thanked them. Her feet hurt by the time it was over. Her chest felt hollow, like something had been taken out and not replaced. Back at the house, the silence returned, but it didn't stay empty for long. Daniel and Erin were already talking again. There are a few things we should take care of sooner rather than later, Daniel said, flipping through his notes. Just to make things easier, Erin added, already pulling another folder closer. Margaret sat down. The papers were there again. Thicker this time. More pages, tabs dividing sections. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm. This is just to consolidate some accounts, he said. It'll make everything more manageable moving forward. Erin nodded. It's really just about simplifying things for you. Margaret looked at the pages. The words were smaller now, denser, less familiar. She adjusted her glasses. Do I need to read all of this? She asked. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second. It's mostly technical, he said. We've already gone through it. Erin smiled gently. We wouldn't have brought it to you if it wasn't straightforward. Margaret held the pen in her hand. It felt heavier than before. She looked from one page to the next, then back up at her children. They were waiting. Not impatiently. Just ready. She lowered her eyes to the paper again. Signed. Another page. Signed. The sound of the pen moving across the paper was soft, almost comforting in its consistency. One signature after another, each one closing something, or opening something else. It was hard to tell which. By the time the folders were closed and stacked neatly together, the house felt quieter again. Not the same quiet as before. This one had direction. Purpose. Margaret sat back in her chair, her hands resting in her lap. Daniel gathered the papers, aligning the edges carefully before placing them into a larger folder. Aaron stood and carried a few things into the other room, already moving on to the next task. Margaret watched them. They were efficient, capable, certain of what needed to be done, and she let them be. Because it felt easier that way. Because everything had already shifted, and she wasn't sure where to stand inside it yet. The quiet from the first day was still there, but now it was layered with something else, something she couldn't quite name. Not fear, not regret, just a small, steady sense that things were moving faster than she could follow, and that by the time she caught up, they might already be decided. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything shifted, no raised voices, no argument. Just a quiet accumulation of decisions that seemed, on the surface, reasonable. 3 days after the funeral, Daniel called it a family meeting. He said it gently, like it was something ordinary. Margaret sat at the kitchen table again, the same one where Frank had been sitting not long ago. The chair across from her was empty now, pushed in neatly, as if no one had ever occupied it. Daniel sat to her right. Aaron across from her, a folder already open, papers arranged in careful stacks. There was a glass of water near Margaret's hand. She hadn't touched it. Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, leaning forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "There are just a few things we need to go over. Nothing complicated. Just making sure everything is in order." Margaret nodded once. She waited. Aaron glanced at Daniel, then reached for the top sheet in her folder. "So," she said, her tone light, almost conversational. "The house." Margaret's eyes moved to her. "What about it?" she asked. There was a pause. Not long, just enough to shift the air. Daniel answered. "It's already been transferred," he said, "legally, a few years ago." Margaret blinked. "I don't remember that," she said. "You signed the papers," Aaron added quickly, "after Dad's first hospital stay. It was just part of estate planning." Margaret tried to place it. There had been papers, yes, many of them. That afternoon blurred together now. Frank at the table, reading glasses low on his nose, Daniel explaining things in the same calm tone he used now. "You said it would make things easier," she said slowly. Daniel nodded. "It does. It avoids complications. Probate, taxes, all of that." Margaret looked around the kitchen, the cabinets she had chosen, the small crack in the tile near the sink that Frank had always meant to fix, the window where she used to watch the neighbor's dog wander too close to the fence. All of it looked the same. But something in the room had shifted, so the house, she said, her voice quieter now. "It's yours?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. Technically, the word settled in the space between them. Technically. Erin leaned forward slightly. It doesn't change anything right now, she said quickly. You're still here. Of course you are. Margaret nodded again. Of course. Daniel reached for another paper. And the accounts, he continued. We've consolidated them. Margaret frowned faintly. What does that mean? It just means everything is in one place, he said. Easier to manage. Safer. For who? She asked, before she could stop herself. Daniel paused. Then he answered, just as calmly. For you, Mom. Erin slid another sheet across the table. It's a managed account now, she said. Joint oversight. It protects you from mistakes. Margaret looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. Mistakes, she repeated. Erin smiled, but it didn't quite land. You know what I mean, she said. It's just precautionary. There was another pause. This one stretched a little longer. Margaret's fingers rested lightly on the edge of the table. She could feel the grain of the wood under her skin, familiar and steady. And my car? She asked. Erin glanced at Daniel. We've been talking about that, Erin said. You don't really need it anymore. It's just sitting there most days. I use it, Margaret said. For groceries, Erin replied gently. Appointments. Things we can arrange rides for. There are services now, Daniel added. Very reliable. Margaret looked at him. He spoke the way Frank used to when he had already made up his mind about something. Calm, certain, finished. Erin reached into her folder again and pulled out a set of brochures. She placed them on the table, spreading them out slightly, like cards. Just options, she said. Nothing immediate. Margaret didn't touch them, but she read the names. Maple Grove Living. Sunrise Residential Care. Willow Creek Community. Each one printed in soft colors. Smiling faces on the covers. Rooms with wide windows and neatly made beds. Places designed to feel like home, without being one. You think I should go there? Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Erin shook her head quickly. Not now. We're just planning ahead. It's about making sure you're taken care of, Daniel added. Margaret sat back in her chair. She folded her hands in her lap, taken care of. The phrase moved through her mind slowly, like something she had heard before but never examined closely. She looked at her children, at Daniel's steady posture, Erin's careful smile. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They believed what they were saying. That was the part she couldn't quite place. What happens if I say no? She asked. The question came out softer than she expected. Daniel's expression didn't change. It's not about saying no, he said. It's about doing what makes sense. Erin nodded. We're just trying to help. Margaret looked down at the table again, at the brochures, at the empty space where Frank used to sit, at the house that felt the same, and not the same at all. Nothing had been taken by force. No one had raised their voice, no doors had been slammed. And yet, the house was no longer hers. The money was no longer hers. Even the decisions, it seemed, were no longer entirely hers. All of it had shifted quietly, carefully, with signatures and explanations and good intentions. Margaret reached for the glass of water and took a small sip. Her hand was steady. She set the glass back down. All right, she said. The word felt strange in her mouth. Not agreement, not acceptance, just something to keep the moment moving. Daniel nodded once, satisfied. Erin gathered the brochures back into a neat stack. The meeting ended the same way it had begun. Quietly, efficiently, as if it had always been meant to happen. Margaret stayed at the table after they stood. She listened to them moving in the other room, voices low, discussing something else now, the next step, the next decision. She didn't try to follow. She sat there, hands folded in her lap, looking at the place where Frank had been. The house hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like something she belonged to. It felt like something she was still inside of. For now. The house grew quieter over the next few days. Not empty, not abandoned, just reorganized. Daniel stayed busy, always on the phone, always writing something down. Aaron came and went, bringing things, taking things, adjusting small details that didn't seem important until they were already done. Margaret noticed the changes the way you notice furniture being moved in a room you've lived in too long. The coat rack by the door disappeared one afternoon. The drawer in the kitchen where she kept loose change was suddenly empty. The stack of unopened mail was sorted, divided, filed away into folders she hadn't seen before. Nothing dramatic. Just gone. One morning, she walked into the garage. Her car was still there, parked in the same spot. A thin layer of dust had settled across the hood, catching the light from the small window above. She ran her hand along the surface, leaving a clean streak behind. She had driven it just last week. Now it looked like something waiting to be forgotten. Mom. Aaron's voice came from behind her. Margaret turned. We were actually going to talk to you about that, Aaron said, stepping into the garage, arms folded lightly. The car. Margaret didn't respond right away. It's just sitting here, Aaron continued gently. We thought it might make sense to simplify things. Margaret looked back at the car. I use it, she said. Not much, Aaron replied. And honestly, it's more of a liability at this point. Maintenance, insurance. Daniel appeared in the doorway as if he had been listening. We can arrange rides, he said. Anything you need. It's safer. Safer. Margaret nodded once. She didn't argue. That afternoon, Daniel drove the car out of the garage. Margaret stood at the window and watched as it pulled away from the curb, the sound of the engine fading down the street she had lived on for 37 years. She didn't wave. She just stood there until the street looked the way it always had. Only quieter. That night, she packed. Not because anyone told her to. Not directly. But the guest room down the hall had been prepared. Fresh sheets, a lamp she didn't recognize, a space that felt temporary, even though no one had said the word. She opened her closet slowly. The hangers clicked softly as she moved them aside. She chose a few things, not everything, just enough to fill a suitcase. The rest she left. It didn't feel like a decision. It felt like something already decided. At the bottom of the closet, behind a box of old photo albums, she found the tin box. She hadn't thought about it in years. It was small, dented at one corner, the kind of thing her father used to keep nails and screws in before it became something else entirely. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Inside were papers, old ones, folded, yellowed at the edges. Receipts, notes, a few envelopes with her father's handwriting, thin, careful letters that leaned slightly to the right. And a map. Not printed. Drawn. Rough lines. Landmarks labeled in pencil. A road that curved off into nothing. She held it up closer to the light. West Virginia. She hadn't seen the farm in over 20 years. Nothing there but rocks and weeds, Frank had said once, years ago, when she mentioned it. She had believed him. Everyone had. Margaret folded the map carefully and set it aside. She went through the rest of the papers slowly, her fingers moving over the ink, the impressions of words written long ago. There were receipts she didn't understand. Materials, supplies, things that didn't quite match the memory she had of her father's life. She paused, then closed the box. Not because she was done, because she wasn't ready to understand it yet. The next morning, Daniel stood in the doorway of the guest room. "We've been talking," he said. Margaret looked up from the suitcase. "About what?" she asked. "Next steps," he replied. "Just making sure everything is set up properly." Aaron stepped in behind him, holding a folder. "There's a place we'd like you to look at," she said, placing the folder on the dresser. "Nothing permanent, just an option." Margaret didn't open it. She already knew what was inside. "I think I'll go somewhere else, Sean," she said. The words surprised even her. Daniel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Margaret reached for the tin box and placed it carefully into the suitcase. "My father's farm," she said, "in West Virginia." There was a pause, a longer one this time. Aaron blinked. "That place?" "It's not livable," Daniel added. "It hasn't been maintained in years." "I know," Margaret said. "Then why?" "Because it's mine," she said. The room went quiet. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. "Mom, that doesn't make sense." "It doesn't have to," she replied. Aaron stepped closer. "You don't even know what's there." Margaret closed the suitcase. "No," she said, "but I know what isn't here." That stopped them. Not completely, but enough. The conversation didn't end with agreement. It ended with something else. A kind of reluctant pause, a space where neither side had fully won. 2 days later, Margaret stood at the bus station. A small building at the edge of town, plastic chairs, a vending machine humming softly in the corner. Her suitcase sat beside her, the tin box tucked safely inside. She counted the money in her purse again. $62. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The bus arrived with a long sigh of air brakes. Margaret stood, adjusted her coat, and picked up her suitcase. No one stopped her. No one tried to change her mind. Daniel had driven her there. He stood near the entrance now, hands in his pockets, watching. Aaron stood beside him. Neither of them spoke. Margaret didn't look back as she walked toward the bus. The driver took her ticket without a word. She stepped inside. The seat by the window was cold when she sat down. She placed her bag at her feet and rested her hands in her lap. The engine started. The bus pulled away slowly, the town sliding past the window in familiar shapes that quickly became unfamiliar. Houses, streets, the grocery store on the corner, then less. Then something else. Open road. Margaret leaned her head lightly against the glass. She wasn't hopeful. She wasn't afraid. Just moving. Because there was nowhere else left that belonged to her. And somewhere far from the life she had just left behind, there was a place people had forgotten. A place no one had bothered to take. Her father's old farm. Worthless. Or so they had always said. The bus ride took most of the day. Pennsylvania faded first. Rows of houses, tight streets, Familiar shapes pressed close together. Then the spaces widened. Roads stretched longer. The sky seemed to open up, pale and distant. Margaret watched it all without really focusing. The glass was cold against her temple. Every so often, it rattled softly as the bus hit uneven pavement. The sound was steady, predictable, easier to follow than her thoughts. People got on, got off. A man with a duffel bag, a woman holding a sleeping child. Two teenagers who spoke too loudly, then fell quiet just as quickly. Margaret stayed where she was, hands folded, eyes forward. When the bus finally slowed near a narrow roadside stop, the driver called out the town name like it barely mattered. Margaret stood. Her legs felt stiff, her suitcase heavier than before. She stepped down onto gravel. The bus pulled away almost immediately, leaving behind a sudden, complete quiet that felt different from the quiet she had known. This one wasn't filled with memory. It was empty. A small gas station sat across the road. One pump, a faded sign that buzzed faintly overhead. Beyond it, trees stretched in every direction, bare branches reaching into the gray sky. Margaret walked over slowly. The air smelled different here. Damp earth, cold leaves, something metallic underneath it all. A young man stood behind the counter inside, flipping through a magazine. "Excuse me," Margaret said. He looked up, surprised. "Yeah?" "I'm looking for the Hale property," she said. "Old farm, about 4 miles out." He stared at her for a second, then nodded slowly. "Oh. That place," he said. "Didn't think anyone was still connected to it." Margaret didn't respond. He pointed out the door. "County Road 17. Follow it past the bridge. You'll see a dirt turnoff on the left. Hard to miss once you're looking for it." "Thank you," she said. "You walking?" he asked. "Yes." He shrugged. "It's a ways." Margaret nodded again. "I'll manage." She stepped back outside. The road stretched ahead, narrow and quiet. No sidewalks, just a thin strip of asphalt cutting through trees and open land. Her suitcase wheels caught on the gravel at first, then settled into a rhythm once she reached the pavement. Step, roll, step, roll. The sound followed her. The sky darkened slightly as the afternoon moved forward. Wind slipped through the trees, carrying a dry, rustling sound that came and went without pattern. A truck passed once, slowed slightly as it approached her. The driver glanced over, curious, not unfriendly, then kept going. Margaret didn't stop. The walk took longer than she expected. Her hand tightened around the suitcase handle as the miles stretched out. Her shoulder began to ache. Her breath came a little shorter than usual, but she kept moving. Because there was nowhere else to go. When she saw the turnoff, she almost missed it. A narrow break in the trees, barely visible. The dirt road beyond it uneven, covered in leaves and shallow ruts. She turned. The suitcase wheels struggled now, catching on rocks and roots. The sound changed, less steady, more resistant. The trees thickened, the light dimmed. And then, the house appeared. Margaret stopped. It stood at the end of the path, exactly where she remembered it, and not at all the same. The structure leaned slightly to one side. The paint, what was left of it, had faded into a dull, peeling gray. The porch sagged near the steps, one corner lower than the rest. The windows were dark, not broken, just empty. The barn sat off to the right, further back. Larger than she remembered, the wood weathered down to a color that blended with the surrounding trees. Everything looked still, untouched, but not abandoned. Margaret stepped forward slowly. The air felt thicker here, colder. She reached the porch and placed her hand on the railing. The wood was rough beneath her fingers, dry but solid. She tested her weight on the first step. It held. Inside, the door opened with a low creak. The smell met her immediately. Damp wood, dust, iron. But underneath it, something else. Something faint. Not decay. Not entirely. She stepped inside. The floorboards shifted slightly under her weight, but didn't give. The walls carried marks of time, scratches, faded lines where pictures had once hung. The kitchen was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was seeing it more clearly now. The sink was rusted along the edges, the cabinets slightly crooked, but everything was still there. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been cleared out. It wasn't empty. It was waiting. Margaret set her suitcase down near the doorway. The sound echoed softly. She walked through the room slowly, each step measured, each breath steady. The house made noise as she moved, small creaks, faint shifts, the quiet language of something that hadn't been disturbed in years. When she reached the back room, she stopped. A window faced the yard. Through it, she could see the barn, standing still, watching in its own way. Margaret didn't understand why, but something about it held her attention longer than anything else. She turned back. The light inside had already begun to fade. She found an old chair near the wall and brushed the dust from it with her hand before sitting down. The wood creaked under her weight. The house settled around her, and for the first time since she had left Pennsylvania, she felt it. Not comfort, not safety, but something quieter, something closer to acceptance. The house didn't reject her. It didn't expect anything from her. It didn't try to organize her, move her, prepare her for the next step. It simply existed. Margaret sat there, hands resting loosely in her lap, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside. The day slipped into evening without ceremony. The shadows lengthened across the floor. The air grew colder. But she didn't move, because even in its broken state, this place still felt like it had room for her. And after everything that had happened, that was enough. For the first night, Margaret slept in her coat. She found an old blanket folded inside a cedar chest in the corner of the bedroom. It smelled faintly of dust and something sweet, like dried leaves pressed between pages. She shook it out once, watched the particles drift in the fading light, then laid it across the mattress without thinking too much about where it had been. The bed creaked when she sat down. The house creaked when she lay back. The wind moved through the cracks in the window frame, carrying a soft, steady whistle that rose and fell through the night. She didn't turn on any lights. There was electricity, she could tell. A switch near the door responded when she tested it briefly. But the bulb flickered, weak and uncertain, and she turned it off again almost immediately. Darkness felt more honest. She closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, not because she was afraid, but because her body was still learning where it was. Morning arrived without ceremony. A pale gray light slipped through the window, spreading across the floor in a thin, uneven line. The air had cooled overnight, enough to make her breath visible when she exhaled. Margaret sat up. Her back ached. Her hands were stiff. But she felt steady. She moved through the house again, slower this time. Not just looking. Noticing. The kitchen first. She opened the cabinets one by one. Plates stacked unevenly. A chipped mug with a faded blue rim. A small tin of utensils that rattled when she touched it. Everything old. Everything used. But not abandoned. She crouched near the sink and turned the faucet. At first, nothing. Then a low cough from the pipes. A sputter. A thin stream of water pushed through, uneven and cloudy. She let it run. Watched it clear. That shouldn't have worked. She straightened slowly. Walked outside. The well stood a few yards from the house. A simple structure. Wooden cover, metal handle. She remembered it from years ago, barely functioning even then. Now it looked maintained. Not new, but not neglected either. Margaret stepped closer, ran her hand along the edge of the wood. There were marks. Recent ones. Not fresh, but not decades old. She frowned slightly, then turned back toward the house. Inside, she opened the tin box again, laid the contents out on the table. Receipts, notes, scraps of paper her father had kept without explanation. She picked one up. Hardware store, concrete mix. Another. Piping materials. Another. Reinforced lumber. Margaret sat down slowly. Her father had never been the kind of man who spent money without reason. He fixed things himself, reused what he could, made do with less. These purchases didn't fit, not with what she remembered. She picked up the map next, spread it flat. The lines were rough but deliberate. The house, the barn, the well, and something else. A marking she hadn't paid attention to before. A small square shape drawn near the house, not labeled, just there. Margaret leaned closer, then looked up. Her eyes moved across the room, measured the space, then measured it again. Something felt off. She stood, walked the length of the kitchen, counted her steps, turned, counted again, then moved into the next room. Did the same. The numbers didn't match. Not exactly. It was small. A difference most people wouldn't notice. But it was there. Margaret went back to the kitchen. This time she looked at the floor. Really looked. The boards were worn, but not evenly. Near the center, just slightly off to one side, the wood had a different tone, faded in a way that didn't match the rest. She stepped onto it, shifted her weight, listened. Nothing. She stepped off, then back on again. This time she bent slightly, pressed her hand against the surface, waited. There it was. A faint movement, not visible, but felt. Margaret straightened. Her breath slowed. She walked to the other side of the room, then back again, crossing the same spot. Testing. The feeling didn't change. Not solid. Not entirely. That shouldn't have been there. The house settled around her. A long, low creak moving through the walls. The wind shifted outside, and beneath it, something else, a draft. Faint, barely noticeable, but consistent. Margaret turned slowly, followed it. It moved across the floor, subtle but steady, tracing a path she hadn't seen before. She knelt, placed her hand near the edge of one of the boards. The air there was cooler. Not by much, just enough. She stayed like that for a long moment, listening, feeling, thinking. Her father's receipts lay on the table behind her. The map still open. The markings she hadn't understood before. Something here had been built. Not abandoned. Not forgotten. Built. Margaret stood slowly. Her knees protested, but she ignored it. She walked to the table again, picked up the receipts, looked at them one more time. Concrete, piping, reinforced lumber. She turned back toward the floor. Her eyes settled on that same spot, the one that didn't match, the one that moved just slightly under her weight. Margaret didn't smile, didn't react the way someone might expect. She simply stood there, quiet, focused. Because for the first time since she arrived, something here didn't fit the story she had been told. And that meant there was something left to find. Margaret didn't rush. She had learned over years of quiet living that rushing rarely made anything clearer. It only made mistakes harder to undo. So she started small. She cleared the table first, stacked the papers neatly, folded the map again, but not the same way as before. This time she left one corner slightly open, just enough to keep the markings visible. Then she went back to the kitchen floor. The board that felt different sat just off-center. Not obvious, not raised, just wrong in a way that didn't announce itself unless you were looking for it. She stepped onto it again, shifted her weight, waited. The faint give was still there. Not loose, not broken, just not solid. Margaret stepped off and looked around the room. There had to be something else. She moved slowly, tracing the edges of the space with her eyes. The walls, the corners, the seams where wood met wood. Then she turned back to the table, opened the map again, laid it flat. Her father's handwriting wasn't precise, but it wasn't careless either. The lines had intention. The measurements, if that's what they were, had a kind of pattern. Margaret picked up a pencil from the drawer. It was dull, worn down from years of use, but it would do. She measured the table with her hand, counted, then measured the room, step by step, heel to toe, one side, then the other. She wrote the numbers lightly on the edge of the paper. Then she compared them to the map. They didn't match. Not exactly. She went through it again. Slower this time, more careful. The difference was small, but it was consistent. A section of space that should have existed didn't. Margaret stood still. Let the thought settle. Then she turned back to the floor. The board, the slight shift beneath her weight, the faint draft she had felt earlier. It wasn't just damage. It wasn't wear. It was something built over. She crouched again. This time she pressed both hands flat against the wood, closed her eyes, and listened. The house creaked softly around her. The wind moved through the trees outside, but beneath it, there it was. A hollow. Not loud, not obvious, but there. Margaret opened her eyes. She reached for the edge of the board with her fingers, ran them along the seam. It was tight, too tight for age. The rest of the floor showed gaps, slight separations from years of settling. This one didn't. She stood, walked to the corner of the room. There was an old cabinet there, leaning slightly to one side. She pushed it, slowly, the wood scraping faintly against the floor as it shifted just enough to reveal more of the boards beneath. Same pattern, same difference. Margaret stepped back. Her breathing had changed. Not faster, just more deliberate. She went outside. The air felt colder now, sharper against her face. She walked around the house, measured the exterior the same way she had measured the inside. Steps, counts, pauses. She stopped near the side wall of the kitchen, placed her hand against the wood, then moved along it, counting, comparing. When she reached the corner, she stopped, turned, looked back at the full length. It didn't line up. There was space inside that didn't exist out here, or space out here that wasn't visible inside. Either way, something was missing. Margaret stood there for a long moment, then nodded once, not in certainty, but in recognition. She went back inside, straight to the kitchen. The board waited where she had left it, unchanged, unremarkable. She walked to the drawer again. This time she looked deeper, past the utensils, past the loose nails and bits of string, until she found what she needed. An old screwdriver. The handle was worn smooth, the metal slightly rusted at the tip. She held it in her hand, tested the weight, then crouched again, placed the tip against the seam of the board, not forcing it, just feeling. The wood resisted at first. Then, with a small shift of pressure, it gave. Barely. But enough. Margaret paused. Her hand stayed steady. Her eyes fixed on the point where the tool met the floor. This wasn't damage. This wasn't accident. Someone had sealed this. Carefully, deliberately. She leaned in slightly. Applied a little more pressure. The board lifted. Just a fraction. A thin line of darkness appeared beneath it. Cold air moved upward, stronger now, clearer. Margaret pulled back. Not out of fear, out of control. She sat back on her heels, looked at the opening, then at the rest of the floor. There would be more than one board. There always was. She stood again. Moved slowly around the space and testing each section, listening, feeling, mapping it out in her mind, the same way she had mapped the house, piece by piece until the shape became clear, a rectangle, hidden, contained. Margaret returned to the first board, placed her hand flat against it. The wood was cool, solid, and no longer just part of the floor. It was a door. She didn't open it, not yet. Instead, she stood, walked back to the table, looked at her father's map again, then at the receipts, then back at the floor. Everything connected now, not fully understood, but connected. Margaret set the screwdriver down beside the papers. Her hand rested on the edge of the table. Steady. Certain. For the first time since she stepped onto this property, she wasn't just staying, she was searching. And whatever had been hidden here hadn't been meant to disappear. It had been meant to wait. Margaret stood there for a long time. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that made small sounds feel larger than they were. The faint creak of wood, the distant shift of wind pressing against the walls. She looked down at the floor, at the line she had opened, at the space beneath it. Then she moved lowly, deliberately. She went to the back room and found what she could use: a rusted hammer, a short pry bar leaning against the wall, tools that had been left behind without explanation. She brought them back to the kitchen, set them down beside the board. Her hands didn't shake, not from fear, but from something else, something steadier. Margaret knelt again, placed the pry bar into the narrow opening she had made, pressed down gently. The wood resisted at first. Then, a sharp crack. Not loud, but final. The board lifted. Dust rose in a thin cloud, catching the light from the window. The smell that came with it was different from the rest of the house. Not just old. Sealed. Margaret pulled the board free and set it aside. Then another. And another. Each one came loose with more ease than the last, as if whatever had held them in place had already begun to give way. The opening widened. Darkness spread beneath it. Not shallow, not empty. Deep. Margaret paused, wiped her hands against her coat, then leaned forward. The air rising from below was cooler. Still. She reached for the flashlight she had found earlier in a drawer. It flickered once when she turned it on, then steadied into a narrow beam. She lowered it into the opening. The light cut through the darkness slowly, revealing space. Not dirt, not empty ground. A constructed space. Wood framing, old but solid. A crawl space, but not the kind built casually. This had been shaped, planned. Margaret shifted closer, lowered herself carefully, one hand gripping the edge of the floor. Her feet found something below. Not far down. She eased herself into the space. The air changed immediately. Cooler, drier, quieter. She stood fully. The ceiling was low. She had to bend slightly. The beam of the flashlight moved across the floor, and then stopped. There were containers, not scattered, not forgotten, placed neatly. Wooden crates lined along one side, stacked carefully, each one sealed, metal edges reinforced at the corners. Margaret stepped closer, knelt beside the nearest one, ran her hand across the surface. Dust covered it, but not thickly, not untouched. She found the latch, opened it. Inside, papers, bundles of them. Tied with string. Organized. Margaret lifted one. The paper was stiff but intact. She untied the string slowly, careful not to tear anything. Her eyes moved across the first page. She didn't understand it at first. Just words. Numbers. Lines. Then something caught. A name. Her father's. Followed by something else. A legal term she recognized, though she had never used it herself. Land rights. Margaret blinked. She shifted the flashlight. Looked closer. The documents weren't random. They were official. Stamped, filed, recorded. She pulled out another bundle. Then another. Each one the same. Different years, different parcels, but all connected. All tied to the same land. This land, the farm. Margaret sat back slightly. Her knees pressed into the dirt floor beneath her. Her breath slowed, then steadied. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was reading. She stood again, moved the light across the rest of the space. More crates, more containers. Each one placed with care. This wasn't storage. This was preservation. She opened another crate. Inside were maps. Detailed ones, survey lines, measurements, coordinates marked precisely across the land, far beyond what she had seen in the simple drawing her father left behind. Margaret held one up, the lines traced across areas she recognized, the barn, the well, the edges of the property, and beneath them, markings, deeper, layered. She didn't need to understand every detail. She understood enough. This land wasn't empty. It had never been. Her father hadn't left it because it had no value. He had stayed, worked, built something no one else had noticed. Margaret lowered the map slowly. The flashlight beam moved again. There, in the far corner, a metal box, smaller than the others. Locked. Margaret walked toward it, her steps careful in the narrow space. She crouched, ran her fingers along the edge. Cold, solid. The lock wasn't complicated. Old. Worn. She reached for the pry bar again, positioned it, applied pressure. The metal bent slightly, then gave. The lid lifted. Inside, more documents. But these were different. Cleaner. Newer. Not in age, but in condition. Protected. She pulled one out, unfolded it, and this time, she understood immediately. Natural gas. The words were clear. Leasing rights, extraction zones, agreements. Margaret stared at the page, then at the next, and the next. Each one confirmed it. This land wasn't just valuable, it was significant. She sat there for a long moment, the flashlight resting on the ground beside her, casting long shadows across the walls. Everything she had been told, everything she had believed, didn't match this. Her father hadn't been holding on to nothing. He had been holding on to everything. And no one had seen it. Not her. Not Frank. Not Daniel. Not Aaron. Because no one had looked. Margaret folded the document carefully, placed it back into the box. Closed the lid. She didn't take anything. Not yet. Instead, she stood, turned slowly, looked at the space one more time, then reached up and pulled herself back through the opening into the kitchen. The light above felt different now, brighter, sharper. The house around her hadn't changed, but she had. Margaret replaced the boards loosely over the opening, not sealing it, just covering it. Then she stood, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table. Her eyes moved across the room, then to the window. The barn stood where it always had, silent, unmoved. And for the first time, Margaret understood. This place had never been empty. It had been waiting for someone to notice. Margaret stood by the window, her hand resting against the worn wood of the frame, looking out toward the field that no one had ever bothered to really see. Not Daniel, not Aaron, not even Frank. She thought about the day she signed those papers, how easily it had all been explained, how calmly everything had been taken. And she realized something that hadn't made sense before. They hadn't taken everything. They had taken what was obvious, the house, the accounts, the things that sat in plain sight. But this had never been obvious. Her father hadn't argued. He hadn't explained. He hadn't tried to prove anything. He had simply left it where it was. Quiet. Unclaimed. Waiting for someone patient enough to ask a second question. Margaret exhaled slowly. The air felt different now. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just clearer. For the first time in a long while, nothing around her was being managed, or arranged, or decided for her. It was all still there. Exactly as it had been. She just hadn't known where to look. Her eyes moved across the land again, tracing lines she could now feel even without seeing them. And somewhere beneath it all, her father had trusted that one day she would understand. Not quickly, Not easily, but fully. Margaret stepped back from the window. Not to leave, but because she no longer needed to stand there searching. Some things don't disappear. They just wait, for the moment someone finally slows down enough to see them. And standing there in that quiet house with everything she had lost behind her and everything she had found beneath her feet, there was only one question left that felt worth asking. If no one had taken it from her, would she have ever thought to look?